the hello. the vast majority of Irish people were living in these kind of rural situations. There were cities in the Free State like Dublin and Wexford and Waterford and Limerick, but the really big industrial cities like Belfast that gave us great products like the Titanic, they stayed in the UK. They weren't part of the Free State. So most people's lives were these rural ones. And most of these people were living that day to day, but they were producing children who, when they grew up, headed to the coast, took a ship and went to a place like the United States, where they were suddenly in a much different circumstance with a very fast-paced culture, with all kinds of technology, with all kinds of things. And they were writing letters home to their family back in rural Ireland about all the things they saw. And those letters needed to be what was called wet letters, which meant they had money in them, because part of the reason for sending your kids off to places like America or Australia or South Africa or England was to earn money to help pay for life back home in the rural regions. So they were, there was every reason for those people in those rural areas to feel that somehow they were like the people left behind. You know what I mean? The people who were backward, the people who couldn't get out to America. And what the leaders of the Free State and these two gentlemen that you see in the slide here wanted to do is to give people kind of a way to understand their rural culture as being really valuable, and to kind of push against that notion of this inferiority of the people who were back in Ireland. Remember that Eamon de Valera had grown up in New York City, so he had this experience himself as well. So that was part of the idea. And as they went to Sweden and learned about folklore archiving, they also learned about the way that Swedish scholars were doing it at the time, which wasn't just about stories or songs, the things that you often think of as the basic pieces of folklore, but also things like how you bake bread and how you do your agriculture and how you build houses, all these things that we call today after the Swedish term folk life. So they were learning about these things, and they wanted to get that knowledge out to people in Ireland. And how would they do that? They're in Sweden, they were paying for a lot of field workers to go out and do all these interviews, but Ireland had very little cash for that. They had this new commission that they created, the Irish Folklore Commission, had only a handful of workers. So how could they get that word out? And Sean O'Sullivan got the idea, let's involve children in doing that. Let's have a project that will introduce school children to all these different kinds of genres of folklore, and then empower them to go talk to their parents, talk to their grandparents, talk to their neighbors, and write down the folklore that they learned and bring it back to school to be carefully copied. There had to be a booklet or instruction booklet that that would help them do that. This is the beginning page of that. And this is in the introduction to that booklet we read. In every rural school in Ireland, the children will vie with one another in collecting from their parents and friends these traditions, and with the friendly help and encouragement of the teachers. There is no doubt that a huge body of very valuable information will be recorded from every part of the country. So there you see something that, if you know Ireland, is very characteristic: competitiveness. You got to get the kids competing against each other, and who's going to find the best, and running home to ask and tell me a better story, and that this competitiveness is part of that. This project ends up involving 5,000 different schools in rural Ireland. 50,000 school children participate approximately 740,000 pages of folklore are collected. It's a rabbit hole, right? It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. And this is how Meitheal Dúchas, who's a wonderful folklorist at the University of Helsinki, describes the project. He says, each week the teacher would choose a particular heading from O'Sullivan's booklet, reading out the questions under that heading and transcribing them on the blackboard. The children would copy these questions and then went home and they would question their people or the neighbors about these matters, writing down in their jotters the traditions or information they could obtain. On composition day in school, they would write down in their copybooks in the form of a composition, the customs, beliefs, and tales which they had collected. Subsequently, the teacher would get the best children in the school, the best at writing and spelling, to transfer these into the notebooks that were then sent to Dublin. So that was the project. And I'm just gonna blitz through so you can see the variety of topics that Sean O'Sullivan was hoping people would talk to their moms and dads about, right? So hidden treasure, a funny story, weather lore, local heroes, local happenings, severe weather, old schools, old crafts, local marriage customs in the penal times, local place names, bird lore, local cures, homemade toys, the lore of certain days, traveling folk, fairy forts, we'll come back to that one, local poets, famine times, games I play, the local roads, my home district, herbs, the potato crop, proverbs, festival customs, churning, my favorite, care of the feet, the local forge, clothes made locally, stories of the Holy Family, the local patron saint, the local fairs, food in olden times, an old story, old Irish tales, a song, local monuments, bread, buying and selling, old houses, stories of giants and warriors, the leprechaun or mermaid, local ruins, religious stories, a collection of prayers, historical tradition, right? So just an unbelievable array of different things that if you know folklore studies, it's a characteristic of folklore that they're interested in absolutely everything. And it's an occupational hazard. You just become fascinating with all these little things. Well, all of this, thousands of pages get sent to Dublin. These booklets are preserved in the archives, and they make all these kind of note cards and notate what's on page 42 of the book that is from this village and so forth. And that is a great resource for folklore researchers, but it's largely inaccessible to the rest of the world because you'd have to make an appointment to go to the archives, put on your special white gloves and sit there and look at things. And it just wasn't something that happened. That's when the project of digitization occurs. And I learned about it by a visit in my folklore course by this wonderful folklorist and ethnomusicologist, Deirdre Ní Chnáile, who is works, and she did a book that's at the University of Wisconsin Press, collecting in the Aran Islands, a Center of History and Practice. And she told me and Jim Leary, we were co-teaching the folklore course at the time, about this new digitization project where the school's collection was going to be made accessible to people on the internet. And this is what gave us the project of Meitheal Dúchas. So it was a high definition PDF of every single page, those thousands of pages of accounts, and a less weighty PDF as well. But PDFs can't be read by machines. And so there needed to be a transcription that would go along with them. And that's where the Irish government came up with again, a cost saving measure, but also a participatory idea of crowdsourcing that transcription. So people could go onto the site called Meitheal Dúchas and see a page and then transfer and type out what's on that page. Hundreds and hundreds of people were involved in that. The pandemic helped because people had a lot of time, but this was then once things are machine readable, they can be searched in all kinds of ways. And they can be aggregated in interesting ways. The term Meitheal Dúchas really comes from Meitheal, which is a work party. So when you are, for instance, cutting peat or turf, as it's often called, you've got one person who's cutting the peat, another person who's picking up the clods and throwing them out of the ditch, another person who's stacking them up so they dry. So that becomes like a work party. So this is a Meitheal Dúchas, is a heritage work party. It's a great Irish name for this kind of shared working that would happen. And at this point, we can see on this diagram that 83% of the Irish materials, the materials that are in Irish Gaelic, have been fully transcribed, and just about 100% of the English has been transcribed. So there's all of this material that is available now to look at. And on the site, now that it's all transcribed, you can search, either you can do the site in Irish, those of you learning Irish, those of you who want to use that Irish, or you can do the English button as well. It's up to you, but you can see these headers on the word "téimi" or themes, and there you can look at different themes or things that have come out. People have written about. One of those categories that Sean O'Sullivan called for was strange animals, right? Strange animals. All the variety. Archaeological research on the continent has derived help from much this story. Is there a story told in your district of a serpent or a large animal which lives in a certain lake or river there? Give the names of the lake or the river concerned. So he's asking these kind of open-ended questions that kids can take home and ask their grandparents. Gee, have you ever heard of this? And oh, maybe I know something about that. So we get these animal lore, 1,000 different stories, water horses, 137 stories about the black pig, 135, 85 versions, right? So, and these often connect with different traditions that we can see continentally. The water horse, or the ushke, is a horse that lives part of the time in the water and comes out and can be very dangerous. You know it from there, the Frozen 2 representation of the Nick that is in that. But that's something we find in the Irish accounts as well as, and the black pig. That's something. There's actually a statue of the black pig here. There's menacing, dangerous pigs that lurk about at night and that do damage to people. And this is a wonderful long story that this little boy, Garrett Connor, wrote down from his grandfather. He says, "My grandfather frequently tells us of the black pig. This is a very mysterious story." So you can imagine this little boy running home and saying, "Tell me about the black pig, because it's a strange animal," and then writing down 3 pages of this story, which is super exciting and interesting and scary in different kinds of ways. You can also look at that site and go by the link to Oitina or to places, and search the site by places. If you click that button, you will get a lot of the details that are connected with this piece of the questionnaire that was my home district, its name, townland, parish, how many people live there, what are their lives like, and so forth, what kind of houses are there. And you'll get to this map with all kinds of links to all those different schools where these notebooks were produced. And then you can navigate it to any particular village. You might not know where you want to go in that map. And there's another great site called Irish Townlands that lets you find out exactly where different townlands are located in Ireland that are mentioned in this site. So when you find out about a particular town, like we'll see in a minute with Skidrow, you can find out where that's located on the map using this Irish Townlands map. So here's an example of one of those stories about the place, the townland of Ballinter. I live in the townland of Ballinter. There are 30 people living in Ballinter. Some of the houses are built with stone, brick, and concrete, and roofed with slates. Others are built with clay and covered with thatch. There are woods in Ballinter, covering about 50 acres. Many pheasants are in the woods. One of the nicest houses in Meath is in Ballinter. It was built in the year 1800. It is 8 stories in height. There are many steps going. So great kind of story. And then if you look at Google Maps, you can find Ballinter, and you can find that Ballinter house. It still exists. In fact, now it's a 4-star hotel. So if you are planning a travel through Ireland and you're wanting to think about places to stop or to look at, this is a resource for finding those different kinds of spots. And this is quite reasonable as a 4-star hotel. But anyways, it's only about, it's just outside of Trim, so it's about an hour from Dublin. And that's the entrance. You can look at Google Roadside and look at the entrance there to the Ballinter house. And the questionnaire also asked people about landlords, about who were the people who lived in these big houses. And that was something that was very important to Sean O'Sullivan and Ghaelaigh as well, because of course, Irish independence was all about dealing with this landlord issue, that so much of the land of Ireland was controlled by wealthy Anglo-Irish or English people who collected rents from people and evicted them at times when they weren't paying their rent and so forth. And so the whole history of Irish efforts for independence were connected with this landlord issue. And so Sean O'Sullivan is asking people about that. And also it has become, at the very time that this project is going on, a huge issue between England and the new Irish Free State, because England wanted the Irish to continue to pay these landlords for their land, and Ireland said, no, it's ours. And end of story. And that created all these tariff wars and so forth. So this was very much part of that. And here's some stories that we get in Ballinter from children asking their parents about that. Mr. Preston was the landlord for Ballinter for about 30 years ago. We hear about Mr. Preston as a very nice one. He gave more land to the Land Commission. That was the commission that was designed to redistribute some of this land. There was also another landlord whose name was Mr. McAvoy. He was one of the worst of his time. And we get this wonderful account of him that ends, I want to move that. This landlord went mad and ate pieces of himself. So it's just great little details like that. Just say, oh, this is full of kind of quirky details. So another thing that you can find out when you look at those the sites in terms of place are stories about fairy forts, because these are sacred places. They are places that are held sacred by people in the area. They're places that you don't mess with. They're hills or knolls that people recognize have some kind of sacrality to them. You never go on them. You never take anything from them. They're called fairy forts or fairy forts, or sometimes raths, or sometimes shia in Irish. And Sean O'Sullivan is asking questions about these as well. Are there fairy forts in the school district? By what name are they called? Are they circular in shape? Is there any story attached to these forts? Who is supposed to live in them, and for what purpose? So he's asking these questions, and kids are running home to ask their parents about them. And this is one of those accounts. In the townland of Skidernach, there's a fort. It's on the side of the road going to Belcarra. It is owned by a man named Michael McHugh. There is a high bank around the fort, because in the olden times, those banks prevented an enemy from going in. There are 3 ways of going in. On top of the bank, there are a lot of bushes, In the middle of the fort, there's a cave. Long ago, it was closed because the man who owns it was afraid of the sheep going down into it. One day, two men were working with a horse in the field and where the fort is, and the horse sees something and gets confused and scared, and they can't figure out what the horse is reacting to. So that, of course, gives us this kind of fascinating situation where these two boys are rushing home to ask their dads about fairy forts in the town. And one of the boys' fathers, James, says to his son, Michael, James and Walter are exactly the same age. They're 50 and they're talking to their sons that are exactly the same age. He says that this fort in the locale was probably a military installation at some time, but there's this mysterious story about a frightened horse responding to it. Whereas Walter tells his son, John, that it was the home of the fairies, the good people, and that he tells this wonderful story about a man going to that, hearing that there's a party going on in there and gets invited in. He has a hump on his back. They take the hump off. He has a good evening of it. But then when he's leaving, they put an extra hump on his back as well. So he leaves with two humps. So it's a great version. Both these are about the same place. So it gives it this wonderful kind of notion. And then you want to see where that place is. And you're thinking, oh, I want to find out. And we know that this is Skitternach, the townland on the road down to Balcarra. So you can go to that Irish townland's site, look up Skitternach, find out where Skitternach is, change it to Google Maps, look at the satellite views, and then if you look there going down the road towards Balcarra, you'll see along the road this place that's almost certainly that place still exists, and people are still, in fact, there's the road views, still respecting it today, right? Or it'd be fascinating to go to that place and ask people, do you have stories about this? And how do those stories connect with what I read in this site? So suddenly the landscape of Ireland becomes alive in a whole new way. You have an access to the stories that people have about these local places, and you can start to see them in new ways. There's other stories about these fairy forts as well. This is one. Oh, I know. You can look at things in terms of people as well. So, people, and there's a story that's collected about elf shop cattle. So cattle sometimes get affected by living in the pasture near one of these hills because the fairies at night are playing with each other and they accidentally shoot some of the cattle, and that's how they get ill. The questionnaire asks about these, and this child, Robert Fair, writes, a man in this district named Foster Gardner has in his possession a set of 5 smooth round stones called elf stones. These stones are supposed to be dropped by the elves or fairies and are rarely found on the land. The man who possesses these stones places them in a can with some water and 3 coins, and they can use them to cure these cattle diseases. Mm-hmm. So a wonderful account, but you have a name, Foster Gardner, right? And you can go to the National Archives and see that Foster Gardner was a man. He was 57 at that time. He was unmarried. He was a Protestant. You get a little bit of information about him, and then you can search his name in this big database and see that he told this really wonderful ghost story to another child who wrote it down about this man who died, but then he returned to Foster's father with the saddle he had borrowed because he had promised to return it alive or dead. So he returns, scary story. And also we learned that Foster was a really accomplished egg recognizer. So he was able to handle the eggs and see which ones were going to be fertile for when you were setting eggs to be incubated. So a man named Foster Carter picks sittings of eggs, and I think to hatch for all the women in the townland. So we see that this guy is really essential locally for what he's doing. And that has, again, connections with a wonderful book that you can look at from University of Wisconsin Press called Packy Jim, and the fact that so many times some of this lore was kept and carried by bachelors or elderly, not unmarried women who had a very particular role to play in the society and maintaining these traditions. So you can kind of look at that notion. I want to look at that notion of change as well. And that's where we can, I knew I had to come back to it. The care of the feet. Why was Sean O'Sullivan asking about care of the feet, for goodness sakes? Well, because he had learned about this process that's called by economists verticalization, which is that in rural life, mostly you made all the things you needed in life locally. And this was the case with shoes. They were being made by local shoemakers and so forth. But gradually what happens is you start to get rural places more connected with stores and manufacturers, and they're starting to buy, for instance, shoes at stores and bring them in. So he wanted to get a feel for how that was happening. And Thomas Fennessy asked his people about that. The people were 13 or 14 years before they wore boots long ago. Some of them never wore boots. Nearly all the children go barefoot in summer. The reason the people did not wear boots when they were young was because there were not many shoemakers and because they were too dear. Right? So it's been transcribed as it's written there. Right? So it's sometimes interesting kind of spellings. Anyways, this notion is also something we can see in this account of the housing, right? So we hear about houses that are built of stone, brick, and concrete and roofed with slates. And this was a process of change that was going on during this time. People think about the houses, the thatched houses of Ireland made out of clay and thatch. Okay, Campbell, who came from Sweden to Ireland to do field work and record and draw those houses. But we know that in 1950, in the north of Ireland, there were some 40,000 thatched houses, and by 2005, there were only about 150 of those left. So there's been this immense change, and in fact, that was going on at the very time that this was this project was happening, because we can see houses like this. That's probably originally a mud and daub and thatched house, but behind it you can see the house that was replaced, made out of concrete and more modern and so forth. And a lot of the writers, the parents of the children, are saying, "I like the house we have now. it's warm and it's fine and it doesn't leak." So they're kind of reacting against the romanticism of the old houses, but you can see that process happening. We also have accounts of churning or other kinds of pieces. We are sending the milk to the creamery at present, and we have no churn, but we had one 3 years ago. It was a barrel churn. It was 3.5 feet in height and so forth and so on. So we can see, again, this verticalization that's happening. The rural places are starting to produce milk that goes to a creamery that then processes it into butter. They're not doing it themselves as in the past. And this is something that we can see reflected in these accounts. So I hope I gave you some ideas. You know now what the school's collection was. You know about the Meitheal Dúchas site that I hope you'll explore. And I hope I gave you some thoughts on how you can look at it in terms of both the continuities that are in that, where we have the same fairy fort still apparently being kept sacred on the roadside near Skid Row on the way to Belcara, and also the way that change was going on during this time with the land redistribution, with the building of new houses, with the connection of local economies to broader economies like creameries and so forth. And so that you'll be able to look at that process of change as it's reflected in those materials as well. So I'll end there. Thank you for listening, and then take any questions. We'll do the reading, anything from there. A question from the audience, Sean.
Did the folklore that was collected come predominantly from any region of the country in particular? Was like a lot of response from a certain area, or was it pretty widespread around the country?
Did the collections come from any particular areas? The commission was very adamant to try to spread this across the whole country to get representative schools from every single area of Ireland. They didn't go to every school, but they went to 5,000 schools that were strategically displayed across the areas. So they definitely aimed at that. They exempted the urban areas in part because they thought, oh, there's no folklore in urban areas, but also because there was sometimes resistance among the teachers about that and so forth. But they did definitely try to be representative about all the rural areas of Ireland in that way. And then it's really interesting in the transcription process, you could see over time that certain areas were getting transcribed a lot faster than other areas, depending on how those places thought about their folk traditions and whether they were kind of excited about it or not. So you would see one school's notebooks being completely transcribed where another one had hardly been touched at all. So.
Question. You kind of touched on this or mentioned this a little bit, talking about kind of there was this element of potentially kind of romanticization going on.
Tons of romanticization.
And I'm just wondering, I mean, the questions that they were asking were so specific and were very leading.
Yeah.
You know, like the question about the landlord, you know, was anyone punished unfairly?
That's right.
They're kind of
right.
Like,
yes. Yeah.
In many cases, I'm sure. But yeah, I'm just wondering if you just had any thoughts on how that affected what was collected, but were there have been things that would be missing that were not, asked about, or kind of how would that affect it?
A great set of questions. And it's when you think about the fact that this was being collected among school children, there were a set of things that actually Sean O'Sullivan in his larger handbook that he made for collectors of folklore who were adults, there were things like participation in violent activities, right? Which was part of the independence movement. You weren't going to ask children to go home and ask, Daddy, what's the IRA? So, that gets completely now. There's nothing about premarital sex. There's nothing anti-clerical in there. So it's very G-rated in that way. And at the same time, it tried to give enough kind of detail that people would go beyond just the surface level, and they would try to think about what was specific to their place and how they understood that. And so sometimes when you read the sections about the potato crop, you really get these dads or uncles or grandfathers who are being very scientific about this is the variety of potato that we grow, and here's how we do it, and here's how we do it, trying to underscore to the child that we're part of the modern world. We're moving forward. This isn't a bucolic, imagined rural Ireland. This is really in Ireland that's moving forward in time. So we see them kind of pushing back against the romanticism, the implicit romanticism of those questions sometimes. Yes, Thomas.
So because they're using children, is there anything there about inconsistency, like their parents or like whatever, or authenticity, I guess, most of the like, is there any way about like, keeping children
Was it going to be, would the data be accurate if children were recording it, right? I think that that was a concern, and the way that that was something that the Solowine was very worked very hard to go to almost every one of those schools and to explain the scientific principles of folklore collecting as it was being talked about at the time, so that they would make that notion, because there were a lot of teachers who would have said, well, Billy has the best version, so that's the one we'll put in the book, and this has a nasty detail, so we'll take that out. And he wanted them to understand that no, we want all the variants, we want all the variations, we want all the details, and that you don't need to Photoshop them. They can be the dirty and perfect kind of things that they are, just as long as they're legible. so neatly written. And so that was what was important in that process of getting the kids to collect. And you find some wonderfully detailed and interesting pieces of information there. It clearly, the part of the idea was that the adults would kind of take responsibility for making sure that their child came to school with something that was credible and that wasn't an embarrassment to the family. So there was that kind of process happening as well. Great question. Yes. There are so many sites of archaeological significance in Ireland that it's almost impossible to protect them all. So they are pretty much protected only because people continue to value them that way. And there's a lot of talk. I remember my uncle and aunt in Meath saying, now that we have a lot of, after the EU happened, a lot of people from outside of the country buying land or summer places in Ireland, will they know to respect those places, or will they just put their fancy house on top of them? so that is a big question. And in some ways, this project helps people find out about those and potentially preserve some of those better from potential destruction in that way. Because one of the reasons they must have survived so well is because people really had stories about terrible things that happened to people who stepped on one of those places, or took some of the wood for fire, or did something else one way or another. Are there any written questions?
Yeah, there are. Here, so one question is the booklet, the questions also available on the website?
Colleen, is the booklet available on the website? It is. It's one of the, when you go to the main website, you'll see it's one of the background things about the project, and you can, all those booklet pages that I showed you are just taken from the website itself. So you can read those accounts of what Shauna Solowine was asking children about.
Cool. And then also Karen was wondering, she said she joined late and she wondered if the novel Madame Lazare was, it's an Irish language novel that came out, but I'm not sure what connection it had.
That's an interesting thought. It's, you know, I think I didn't mention that, Karen, but it's a great point. And I will mention in that it's really exciting that there's so many Oscar nominees who are Irish people, including films in Irish for the first time being celebrated. So there's a lot of ways in which these materials that are in the collection still are really important to people and still are filtering into literary and filmic representations in different kinds of ways. And so The Quiet Girl, I think you see a whole set of elements of it by looking at this representation of farm life during that life period. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 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 That's one I'm afraid to watch because but it's gotten a lot of really great press, and it's I'll have to watch it like this. I did.
Loved it, but it's not for us.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I had another question too. I was wondering, I mean, it seems like such an unusual approach to have children collecting folklore. And I was just wondering, was that something that that they came up with within Ireland, or
It was their idea. It was their idea. It later becomes something that gets taken up in the United States by the Foxfire Project, that does the same thing in Appalachia. And there's a lot of folklore projects across the country and folklore and education that do similar things, but it all comes after the school's collection. School's collection is really unique. And in Sweden, where this model was coming from, they were using professional collectors or college students who were going back home for the summer and talking to their families. So the idea of getting children to be involved was very much Sean Sullivan's idea. Yeah, because it kind of does so many things at once, because it was a language art activity. It also was one that would make them realize that they had traditions around them, that they brought attention to their elders and so forth in cool ways. So when you meet somebody like Foster Gardner, who would have been a kind of old bachelor character and on the margins, and has elf stones, he's able to candle eggs, and now suddenly in this way he becomes like this hero in itself. It must have been really a profound aspect for his life and for his status in the community. Right. Then we'll say, thank you for listening. And I've been really, really glad to share this all.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining. And I just wanted to thank all of our sponsors as well for this week. We had sponsors from Language Sciences, from the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic Plus, and the Folklore Program, and also the Center for European Studies. So thank you all so much for being here, and we hope to see you at some of our other events later in the week. Have a great day. Slán.